have just a few tips before we start drawing our row of cars. My first tip is we have to see these cars not as cars, but as lines of shapes in relationship and in proportion to each other in a certain way to create this effect of a row of cars parked down the street. Because our biggest challenge of trying to draw a car is that we're thinking all the time of what a car looks like, often side on, front on, or back on. And that will influence what we draw, particularly with the wheels. Instead of drawing our wheels like this, we're going to want to draw them more like this because we know they're round and there's not much that's round there or here. This wheel is at an angle because this is a fairly steep street sloping down from top to bottom. So they've turned their wheels in so that if the handbrake fails, the car will just nudge into the curb and stop. And my second tip is after we've drawn the first car, the closest car, which will be this one, line everything else up in relation to this car. So for instance, back here, it's pretty much still level with this car on the roof, and down here at its wheels, it's in fact in the upper half of the car. That way we can keep our lines close together enough. It is such a challenge not to let the lines get too far apart. Sometimes by the time we allow for the actual thickness of the line, there's not much room for the shape that we're drawing with them. So we have to keep an eye also on the overall proportion, shape, size of what we're doing. So let's start. So as I said, I'm starting with this closest car. Now this car is not actually parked in the same row as the others. It's actually on the road where the road narrows slightly for a pedestrian crossing. And there's actually a car parked in front of the first car we can see behind this car. That's totally obscured by this car. Now, this took me about 18 minutes to draw in real time. So you're watching this just a little bit over double time. Most of this was drawn with a 0.3mm pen, but the 3 or 4 cars up the back were drawn with a 0.2mm pen because the lines simply became too thick for the amount of detail I was drawing and just the actual size of the car. This street slopes upwards from front to back, and so that does affect the relative position of each of these cars in relation to the first car that I've drawn. So I'm drawing this car. If you've seen my video on how to draw a car, I'm carrying out the technique that I espoused there. One thing that I didn't do carefully enough is the extreme right fender of this car. If we look at the reference, I didn't bring that out far enough. I need to pay more attention to the profile of the side of the car that doesn't have the side view attached to it. It looks a bit as if the car compresses a bit on the right hand side. That's partly because my camera is not angled parallel to the paper. So I've got this car roughly drawn in. So now that I've got this first car pretty much done, just finishing some of the details with it, I'm putting the side mirrors on. Side mirrors are really important when we draw cars because they're such a quick, easy way to say this is a car. And regardless of the perspective of the car, they really stick out from most views, except from straight side on. They really do stand out and they just say car. So always good to include them, particularly once we start having less detail that we can show on these cars that go further back. So I'm drawing now the first of the 8 cars that I draw that are stretching back behind this car. And as I said, the challenge is to not let the car become too high, too wide, but to keep it as tight as it really is, to capture, if you like, all the distortions of the side from this angle, from this perspective. And so I measure the tops of these cars with the tops of the cars adjacent in the reference, and I also measure where their tyres touch the ground with what we see of the car adjacent to the right as well. And I use those as my tops and bottoms, and I know I have to squeeze the car between those 2 lines, and that helps me to keep the scale nice and tight, because the risk really is that as we draw these cars, they just bit by bit get larger and larger, and it becomes harder as the cars move further back and they become smaller and smaller. In fact, they become so small that it really starts to become difficult to draw the lines we want to draw with our pen, in this case my 0.3mm pen. It becomes harder to draw the lines that close together without them joining together, and so the temptation is to shift the lines themselves apart a bit. But that can greatly increase the size and proportions of something which we're drawing in such a compressed and small way. So I'm working hard not to do that, being careful to measure where the bottoms of the tyres are. And I realise at this point I can't keep using this pen. In fact, I probably should have switched to my 0.2mm pen for the last car, but better late than never. And I hope you see the difference that using the 0.2 now makes to my ability to draw the scale of this car the way I'd like to. But I'm still measuring it up against the car next to it. I'm still defining the top and the bottom and how far to the left we see it, and particularly trying to capture these triangular shape, these wedge shapes that we end up getting. And particularly with the side windows, we can barely tell what they are. There's almost no width to them besides the actual line work itself. The one thing we do see as they go up are all the little side mirrors sticking out, and so I tried to remember to put each of those in. So we get to these last couple of cars and it really is just an abstraction of lines and a few little triangular shapes. We probably wouldn't be able to recognize them as a car, I don't think, if we didn't have the larger ones to the right that give us the clues we need. You see me just now checking my overall width to see did I get the proportions roughly correct, and it pretty much was the same distance using my finger measurements from left to right on reference and drawing, so that was good. I decided to add a little bit of street context to this, so I put in the pedestrian crossing that this first car is stopped on, and I don't quite get the angle right of this one that I think I'm drawing just now, and that causes problems then when I go to put the double lines in, because it's meant to line up with the angle of that pedestrian crossing band. And if I line it up, it's not going to leave room for a lane between the parked cars and the line. So I make a little bit of a compromise in how I position it and where I position it. And I think for the sake of this drawing, I get away with it. And I also think, just as I'm finishing, look, I'll put some street signs along. Again, for a bit of easy to draw street context, but also it gives me a chance to show some perspective, to show some scale, to show some distance, that things are moving off into the distance. I mean, these aren't regularly spaced, they're all different widths apart, but it still gives me a sense of showing that they get smaller and smaller. And then now I do some shadow under the closest cars, and this shadow I think is always important to put because it really somehow makes the car look a lot more real, look a lot more solid, really increases the three-dimensionality of its look. And then just a bit of detail inside this car that I think we could probably see. And I've decided not to try and draw the shop fronts because that would really overwhelm the point of this particular video, and wondering what else I should do, and that's pretty much it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. If you'd like to draw it, this reference photo is on my channel community page, so why not give it a go? But look, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.